Okay, welcome to ACTV. I'm here with Nicole Bird. Nicole, for those of you who may not be familiar with you or your work, can you tell us who you are and what it is you do?
Well, my name is Nicole Bird. I am currently a teacher of writing. I teach screenwriting as well as creative writing in general, helping students establish and find their voices as writers. I'm also a screenwriter. I am a producer of short horror content. I'm also a published short story writer and poet. Just all around a lover of writer and all things writing. So thank you for having me.
Oh, no problem. We're glad to have you here, and we're kind of celebrating the release of Pulp Modern Die Laughing. Pulp Modern, which has been around since 2011, is now a motion picture. We're hoping to sort of evolve the whole indie publishing scene in a certain way. And your short film, Mirrored, really contributed to that. And so I was wondering if you could tell us how Mirrored came into being.
Well, Mirrored came into being basically over discussions with my creative partner on the film, Ryan Shovey. He had this idea of a mirror that comes to life and shows a demonic side to the person in the reflection, and then we just sort of spitballed from there. I was really interested at the time in kind of the shadow work, just working with the shadow of the individual, and every individual has a shadow within them. And so, how would that manifest in the reflection? That a mirror is kind of a really creepy thing inherently. We have to look at ourselves, and it can either go the route of narcissism, where we fall in love with ourselves, which is dark in itself, or it can go the route of we see the darkness within ourselves and it terrifies us. And that's sort of how Mirrored grew.
When you talk about the shadow self, are you referring to Carl Jung?
Yes, yes, yeah. Just sort of that integration of the shadow is the ultimate goal. But I mean, how often do we really do that? Would there be any horror movies or horror stories if we all integrated our shadow? I'm not sure about that.
Do so you've got me curious now whenever someone brings up Jung and the shadow self. We often hear people suggest that Jung's psychology is superior to Freud's psychology. But would you maybe agree to some extent that the shadow is pretty much the same thing as the unconscious? Or do you think there's a difference there?
I actually think there can be commonalities, because there is, like if we talk about the unconscious, we talk about the collective unconscious and what we can mine from that. And that same phenomenon occurs with the shadow. Like if you see groups of people just being bewitched in a sense by this collective energy and the collective shadow. So I think there absolutely are commonalities in terms of Freud versus Jung. I think, I don't know, it's actually kind of interesting. Like there are places where they intersect, like the Venn diagram, but then there are places where they deviate. I actually read this article really recently that Freud had written, and it was about the macabre, like the uncanny that is in horror, and the different versions of that can occur. So I think both minds really did do so much work to establish modern horror.
And, yes, actually, I have some beliefs that have gotten me cussed at. That I believe Freud and whoever, I don't even know if Freud came up is the originator of the idea of the unconscious, but I believe he was influenced heavily by Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Robert Louis Stevenson. I believe those both came out before Freud was writing and borrowing from some of his contemporaries. So I've always found that interesting, and it makes it, what you just said kind of plays into that, that he would have an interest in horror. Because again, I have a very unpopular opinion that the monster in the book Frankenstein doesn't actually exist. That it is the doctors. I don't even know if he's a I think he's a student. But anyway, the main characters unconscious or shadow self, if you will, because he's always unconscious, like literally unconscious, when the monster is doing its business.
Hmm.
And people say, well, they're both seen on the mountain in the end of the book, but people forget this book starts. It's been a while since I've read it, but Frankenstein starts as like a letter of someone else's recounting of that story. So there's all these layers there. And the most telling thing is that the student or the doctor is always unconscious
Hmm.
when Frankenstein is or not Frank, but when the monster is running around doing its business. And the whole creation of this monster is some sort of alchemy. It's not anything like what we see in the movies. It's more mystical the way it's
Hmm.
created. So I don't know. Okay. Uh, oh, go ahead. Do you have
No,
something?
yeah, I actually I find that fascinating. I had not thought of Frankenstein as a sort of, maybe it might have been an outgrowth of his own unconscious, or his own, like a splitting or fracturing of his identity. So I find that
Mhm.
fascinating. I mean, and also too, so many people took from Mary Shelley and they don't give her her due credit. So I would agree with you
Cool.
there as well. She heavily influenced those lines of thought.
So earlier when we were talking about the shadow self, you mentioned the idea of a collective shadow that would draw crowds. Do you think we have a little bit of that going on in the United States right now?
Uh, yeah, I think we can absolutely
Absolutely
see
see.
the collective shadow maybe activating. I think social media can be an example of that. Just if you look at comments sections and the vitriol that just goes and back and forth like a ping pong ball very freely, it's kind of alarming. And all I can think really is like, well, there is this collective energy, this collective shadow energy that, whether we know it or not, we are permeable to it. I mean, we're kind of like sponges, human beings, and our minds. There's so much about the mind that we do not know, and the content we consume and what we read, the words, what we hear, everything. We're absolutely susceptible to that. It's an unfortunate place where the American political climate is right now.
Do you think that social media is drawing out more of individual shadow cells? Uh, in other words, it's allowing people to bring out the darker aspects of their personalities without fear of repercussion. Because
I would
it's,
agree. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, because it's you're behind a screen, you're behind a keyboard. It's, the things that people say on Twitter oftentimes I think in real life would lead to a lot of broken teeth, but because everyone is safe, in their proverbial mommy's basement, they feel like they can get away with more.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would agree that there's a sense, it's like the metaphor behind that series Black Mirror. Like that is what we are looking at. We're looking at a black mirror that unfortunately it does not reflect ourselves, because if we look at the short film Mirrored, the essence of that film is almost reckoning with what we see in the mirror, but in a sense of, it's a horror film, so there is some distance from that intellectualization of it. But with social media, it's like, it is a mirror, but we don't see ourselves. We see everything that ever existed, from how to make a perfect sandwich to what horrors and atrocities are happening halfway around the world, or completely around, who knows. So there is a sense of distance from all of that. We become desensitized to it. And so then when we no longer have that empathy, what happens? It's definitely something that should be made into a horror story of some kind, whether visual or literary.
Well, it's good that you brought us back to Mirrored. So you adapted your screenplay into a short story for the accompanying issue of Pulp Modern that goes with the movie. And I wondered if you could talk to us about that process of turning your screenplay into a short story, which is often the reverse direction that such things go.
Adapting the mirrored screenplay to a short story was actually a really intriguing process, because you're taking, like you had said, it's typically the other way around. But taking a short script that is usually, scripts are only visual storytelling. We only see what's on the surface, and then you have to utilize visual methods in order to not only show character development, but also exhibit a narrative arc as well as tell a story. That's the great hat trick of screenwriting. And then adapting that into a short story wherein prose is the science of interiority. We are privy to internal thoughts, we're privy to the internal world of the character, and then how does that translate to the page? I think your editing guidance was invaluable during that process, because I kind of put everything on the page. I said, okay, let me put this in Dylan's interior life as well as what is occurring. And then over the editorial stages, it became the short story that it needed to become, which was it was action oriented while maintaining that visual storytelling that to reveal the interiority of the character. I was really grateful for that process.
Oh, I'm glad to hear you say that. As you know, I discovered after the first round of suggestions I sent you that you teach creative writing. So I was horrified. I thought, oh, why am I telling a creative writing teacher how to write her story? But I
No way,
did.
writers always need editors. So no matter what they do for a living.
I like that you really gave us. We were able to get a lot more backstory on that character, because in the film, I don't want to give too much away, but the heart of his problem is seen in just kind of a flash, which is the relationship with the woman that went sour. And we get a lot more of that in the short story. So was that something you consciously thought of ahead of time, or as you were writing it, you just realized, oh, I can flesh this out more, and you know what I'm saying? Like, was it spontaneous, or did you sit down and meticulously plan this? Was this something you wanted to show in the movie, but because the nature of the medium, you were limited that way?
Yeah, in writing the script, I can safely say Ryan and I were obsessed with Mirrored for a great deal of time. It was a pretty glorious time in our lives, because it was just over a year of us really digging into the story, not just on a script level, but when it came time, it was time for the pre-production. And the pre-production was hearty and robust. And throughout the pre-production, we were still working on the story, because there was a lot to be mined there. And with, you know, Ryan's shot selection dovetailing into the visual storytelling, and even post production, we spent a great deal of time developing it. And then also too, the lead actor, Aaron J. Rome, and then who played Dylan's ex-girlfriend in the film, Ashley Lenz. They were really great as well. They helped in the development. That entire scene in which we see it in the mirror and Dylan has to reckon with it, that was completely improvised on their end. So it was just, Mirrored was truly this, you know, the kind of flash in the pan thing that people talk about, and then when you're around it, you can feel it. Like when you know love is real, like when human beings know love is real, or when death is around, it's sort of evolutionary, like it's primordial. You sort of know when everything is coming together, and that's what Mirrored was. It was something that we really developed, and then it was fun to take it to a short story place because I said, wow, okay, I could kind of run off into a meadow, you know, like that dream of a writer, like, yay, I can skip it into the sunset and really, really flesh this out and give Dylan more pathos that you know, tonally it wasn't the tone that we were going for in the short film, but the short story, it lent itself to a more interior world and being with Dylan and sitting with him in his experience of having failed in his relationship, but having to reckon with his own demonic shadow in the mirror.
Uh, Now you did something in the story where we really get into his mind, and I'm just curious because I often hear this criticism of male writers trying to write female characters, and you always hear, "Oh, men can't write women." Do you ever feel the opposite could be true? That um, oh, women can't really write male characters. I mean, I don't believe it. Trust me, I don't. You know, we have hundreds of years of literature that demonstrates that women can write men very well. But I'm just curious in this day and age where identity politics and representation and all that is now paramount in writing. Is that something that ever crosses your mind?
Um, you know, it does. I do think about that because I think of course there are certain stories that should be told by someone belonging to that community. I think, you know, like I'm a Latin American woman. My family's from Puerto Rico. I have lived in America my whole life. I don't think I could write a story outside of my ethnic group. That's just how I feel. But I do think as writers, we know when something is inauthentic. I think that's always what we're going for. It's like the great book from John Dufresne on writing fiction that it's called The Lie That Tells the Truth. I think that's what we're always trying to do. We're always trying to find some truth in what we're writing. And so I do think there are instances in which I've read writing from men and the, you know, female characters are flat or are only there as part of this sort of object in a sense. But I've read male writers that write brilliantly with female characters. Like if you read anything by Juno Diaz, it's absolutely beautiful and brilliant. If you read John Bolton's poetry, it's absolutely gorgeous and captures a truth about existence. So I think it's that. I think it's like, are you writing something that is authentic and human? And if so, that gender lens won't matter. That was something I really worked at with writing Dylan. I said, okay, I have to get to this place of I want to do this male experience of what he is going through. I want to do it justice, and I want to tell a truth that anybody could pick it up and relate to, feeling like I hate what I see in the mirror, and then oh god, I'm terrified by what I see in the mirror. Anybody can feel that.
Right. So you said something interesting that you don't think that you could write a story outside of your ethnic group. But what about just a character? Do you think that's acceptable or?
Um, I think so. I think so. I mean, I did that with Dylan. Dylan is a white male, white American male, and I am not. So I think it's, again, getting into the truth of the experience, of removing everything else, because at the heart of it, we're human, and this is really a story about um, self-loathing and the lengths that self-loathing can take you. So yeah, I think if you know the heart of it, if you know the foundation, yes, then it can be done.
So the idea of self-loathing is not exclusive to any parameter, right? Uh,
Yeah, definitely.
every time
we
I look at my bank account, I experience self-loathing.
Any writer can tell you
Yeah,
they've experienced self-loathing.
yes. Okay, well, that's fascinating. I didn't want to run off into controversy land, but it's just that's an issue that really fascinates me because and I've I've got three nearly useless college degrees in the liberal arts, and all I was told as a white male is that my opinion is irrelevant. And I just sometimes I look around America, I'm just like everybody here is we're neighbors. We're neighbors. We work together, and we're all having a human experience. And I just personally believe like if you so there's such a thing as writing, and this is much more common in the older days, writing where you're mocking somebody who's different from you in some way, and obviously that's uh, a waste of time. I think that's a waste of everybody's time to write it or to read it. But writing in general, or and really art in general, I've always thought is an act of empathy. Um, it's why in acting in Hollywood, it's always bizarre to me when someone says, "Well, so and so can't play a paraplegic because they're not paraplegic." Well, but the whole point of acting is getting into someone else's shoes. That may not be the best example there, but you know what I'm saying? Like it's a fine line though, because I also understand the idea of feeling mocked by somebody that may have no idea, what your experience is like. Uh, anyway, I'm sure that's a debate that's going to go on for a long time. Let's discuss something a little more fun. So I watched one of your other horror films. I think it's called Lovers. It's
Oh,
or
yes,
Lover,
Lover.
Lover.
Yes,
Yeah. Is that the same? That's the same actor, isn't it?
it is. Yes.
Um, so I was just wondering how you developed your interest in horror.
Oh, well, how I developed my interest in horror, I think it just began, well, I have to be totally honest. It began when I was 12 years old, and Scream had just come out in, what was it, 1996, 1997, and I begged my mother to rent it from Blockbuster Video, and I wore out the video cassette from Blockbuster. and and that my local Blockbuster was calling my house wanting it back, and then finally my mom bought it for me, which I was very grateful. And I just really fell in love with horror. I also really loved Alfred Hitchcock. I found horror interesting because I thought it was a place to discuss not only things that were happening in society. It could speak to a larger threat or fear that was felt collectively, but it also it made sense for me, the daily cruelties of life. Like, horrible things happen. I think that's a very cool thing about Halloween. Halloween is, I mean, maybe my all-time favorite horror. I could pretty much put it on at any time, and it's about these evils that are just sauntering through our daily lives, and it's in a safe place, quote unquote. Haddonfield is a safe place, and so it can happen anywhere. I just found horror very, very interesting, and I loved Psycho. Psycho was another movie that I loved, that um this woman who just happened to be on the run ran into a psychopath, and that was it, and that was the end of Marion Crane, and which was super interesting in terms of story structure. It's like we're almost halfway through the film and the main character's gone. It's just, it kind of pushes. I think that's the thing about horror. It pushes what we can do with a story, which was what Psycho did, which was what Halloween did, which was what Scream did, and then as you can see, slashers are my favorite. there's a there's a running theme. It also speaks to a larger societal fear. And the third thing that I really love about horror and how I got interested in it is that it's global. People find things scary, no matter if you're in, you know, Morocco or Colorado or Canada. It's like everyone can find something lurking in the dark scary. So it crosses those barriers as well, like those differences between us. Like comedy is a harder sell. Comedy will fit into certain markets, certain cultures will find certain things funny, whereas other cultures won't. Horror bridges those gaps. So I just find it really interesting. I don't know. I still do. I still find horror interesting. It never ceases to be.
Um, so we share a I think a love of the slasher film. So I have to ask you, what are if you were asked for say a top three slashers, what would make that list?
I mean, I think I've named them: Psycho, Halloween, and Scream. Those are the top three that I could watch at any time. I'm also a fan of the derivatives of them. I mean, I was happy with Halloween 2. I thought Halloween 2 was really good. Even the new Halloween trilogy, like Halloween Ends, I very much enjoyed. I mean, or Scream. I love all the Screams. Um, I'm a pretty loyal fan in that sense. Like if it's happening, I'm just happy to be watching another Halloween movie.
Halloween Ends, as you may know, was a little bit controversial. Um, because of the internet and social media, we get to hear everybody's opinion. And as with a lot of things these days, Halloween Ends seem to really polarize the audience. So I'm of the belief that I thought that it probably was the best of the latest trilogy or whatever you want to call it. It was the most interesting. It did something interesting with the whole formula. Um, what did you think though of the those who people were vehemently against that movie? They I saw people writing that the movie should be treated the way Michael Myers is treated in the end of the movie, where he's you know um,
Pulverized.
you know is this another case? I guess what I'm really getting at here is this another case of as within Halloween 3 season of the witch. um, there are Halloween fans who think this movie has got to be about the guy in the mask stalking girls, or not girls but teenagers, or it's not a Halloween movie.
Hmm.
um, and as we know, we lost. um, I guess we're just veering into Halloween 3, which I forewarned you we would do that. Um,
I'm excited about it.
um, Halloween 3 is so weird because I'm a little bit older than you, and I saw it on HBO at a sleepover with a bunch of people back when it was relatively new. And as a kid, I was like in the fifth grade, and as a kid, we were just like, "Oh, that's interesting." Right? It wasn't more of Michael Myers, and that's okay. It was interesting, but the general opinion back then was this is not a Halloween movie. And the result is, as you know, we lost the opportunity to have a different Halloween movie every year. This is now there's tragedy, there's real tragedy in the world, but in movie tragedies, I consider this one of the biggest tragedies. Did
Yes.
can you do you like any of the like Halloween 4, any of the stuff that came after that initial wave of Halloween movies?
I
I know
mean,
you like Halloween 3.
yeah, Halloween 3. I think is really brilliant. I mean, Halloween 2 I wasn't mad at because I find a horror movie set in a hospital to be fascinating because hospitals are very scary. You've got a great set piece there immediately. Halloween 4, 5, I wasn't a fan of, but even though it kind of, you can see where they got the idea for Halloween Ends from Halloween 5, because that's when, well, Halloween 4 is when Michael Myers' spirit goes into the little girl, right? Or is that 5? I think 4, it
Well,
happens at the end of 4, and then 5, we see it manifesting. But it's so funny. I went through a period of kind of being obsessed a little bit with H2O with Halloween 20 years later, but I realized that many years later it's because they used part of the score from Scream to score Halloween 20 years later. So I'm like, oh, well, this is same but different. So I mean that explains why. But then Halloween, the one after that, where it's like she didn't decapitate Michael Myers, it was someone else. That was terrible. And then I liked Halloween, the 2018 one, because I thought it was so very elegantly done in terms of the cinematography and the writing. And then Halloween Ends, the second one I didn't totally enjoy. But that was an example of the collective shadow, that second one. Um, but Halloween Ends I enjoy because it harkened back to Halloween 3. That was the original intent for Halloween, was that we would have a new Halloween story every time. Um, and uh it kind of spoke to also that it's like Michael Myers, it's not Michael Myers. Michael Myers is just assisted by evil forces. And those evil forces continue despite Michael Myers being gone, despite the shell of that evil force being um being utilized and then destroyed. That still there is something intangible about evil, and that's what I find interesting. I think that gets to the essence of Halloween, especially at the end, that Michael Myers, in the original one, he survives being shot several times, and then he just disappears. And so I think that's what I enjoyed about Halloween 3, was that it spoke to another type of intangible evil. um I also love Tom Atkins, like what a hero of the 80s. So I was happy to see him, and then the way it's done, and then the sort of this what's the word I'm looking for? This like ambiguously kind of dour, macabre ending. That was really satisfying as well. Oddly, I don't know why, but I think because it's like a great ending is unexpected as well as inevitable. A story could not have ended in any other way but you're still surprised by it. Um, it's a shame that Halloween Ends. Everybody hates it. I was just talking about Halloween Ends yesterday with my students, and the entire classroom was like, "Oh, it was terrible," blah, like, spewing their disdain. And I don't really understand why. It was a very satisfying. Also, too, it's like, what woman hasn't become emotionally involved with a terrible man who there were red flags and she ignored them because of her own traumatic past. I can't think of anything more relatable. So I think it's a shame, but I do wonder if that was a story for another generation. I mean, I think in terms of what the audience expects and wants for story and horror, it has changed just as the world has changed. That's the thing about horror. It evolves and it moves um with the evolution of the times. And that's the thing about it, is that story is holistic. We move with story, and then story moves as well. The needle moves.
yeah, I wonder though. I think a lot of very important horror films along the way have actually moved everything for us. I think Psycho moved things forward. I think Black Christmas, the original Black Christmas, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre both came out in '74, which was a phenomenal year for horror. That's also the year. Have you ever seen Deranged? The movie Deranged?
Never.
Oh, that's I strongly recommend that. That's possibly the most accurate depiction of Ed Gein, just kind of spiritually accurate. It's a fictitious take on it, and it's a Canadian film. Again, the Canadians, the low budget Canadian horror from that era is always really fascinating, and um, it's a little bit of a disgusting movie. It has one of the most unnerving scenes you'll ever see in a movie. I'm not going to give it away, but one of the more interesting things is there's this kind of Rod Serling kind of narrator that in the throughout the first part of the movie he just steps out, like the camera will go over here and then he'll be standing there like a reporter and he'll say, and he'll kind of narrate the story where it's going. But then when things get really serious, he just disappears. You don't see him again. It's really, and it's got a church organ soundtrack because it's a small town. It's supposed to be a small Midwestern town, and I just think it's fantastic. But anyway, that's a very obscure kind of movie. Hopefully, it gets more attention. And this is kind of what I was getting at is that some movies, some horror movies, especially, take a while. You're right. Like Halloween ends in another generation or so. It'll be like Halloween 3. The next generation will see it and they'll realize here's this movie in the sea of remakes and rehashes and just the same old crap being recycled again and again. Here's this movie that tried to do something different, and I think that they'll really appreciate it. So it's Nietzsche once wrote, "Only the day after tomorrow belongs to me," and I think that that applies to Halloween Ends.
Oh, that's a great one.
Okay, well, we got to wrap up here, but before we go, can you tell us what we can expect from you in the near future in terms of your work?
Well, I actually you can read my poetry. It's published in a number of literary magazines. I've gratefully gotten a lot of publications this year. Um, you can find it in you can check out my website, NicoleBirdTheWriter.com, and you'll see all of my listings of publications and where you can read my work. I've also got a poetry collection coming out shortly. It's titled Baptized by Earthquake, Poems About Hollywood. So just a lot of poetry about my time in Hollywood, about story. And I'm also working on a magical realism novel right now, sort of in the vein of like 100 Years of Solitude, multi-generational Latino family narrative. So just writing, teaching, writing, and watching.
Okay, well, it was very good to talk to you today, and hopefully we could talk again in the future.
I hope so. This was wonderful. Thank you for having me.